Hey, this is Japers. Hey, this is Travis here. Look at this nut. So this is the nut. I'm going to get out of the picture here because that's very, very bright, but we can't really show much on the nut without having this doggone insanely bright light here. So this is the nut that was on the guitar. I'm pulling that off. Like we had seen before, it wasn't fastened in. Now what I will do, and you can see it's just like those cooking shows where they have all the food prepped. I've done this before here on this. So take my file, get to the straight element of it. I want to get past this curve here. I don't want to use this. I want to use this part, the flat part, and just square the bottom of the slot up. You want to have a good surface for your glue to adhere to, but at the same time, the gluing down of the nut isn't some super crazy serious structural element here, so we don't have to go crazy on it. And from there, I test fit the nut blank. You don't want the nut to just hammer in there. You want it to be loose enough so that it can move around a little bit. Because if you just get it so tight, then as soon as you have wood moving when it gets cold or warm or whatever, then you wind up with problems. You don't want problems. All right, so what I've done here is I have evened it up with the fretboard using, once again, the flat edge of my file. I can actually double check that with the flat edge of my straight edge here, my square. You may wonder why I keep the strings on here. That comes later. Now I could take them off the tuners, and that probably would have saved me a certain amount of headaches so far, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. Okay, so now I have that right there. I'm just going to hold it tight. Take this pencil. I'm just marking the overhang on the edge so that I can sand that down. I'm going to do a lot of the slotting work off of the guitar, at least the prep for the slotting work, because it's easier to film off of the guitar. We don't have this sort of wacky setup. A lot of times for measuring the depth or for marking the depth, people will take a pencil and take it to the belt sander and cut it in two. That works really well. I've always done that in the past. This time around I was feeling kind of lazy, so I don't know if you can see very well here. I took my little guy from the fret leveling. This is a little piece of lead from a mechanical pencil. I just taped that to the side there, had it on a flat surface, and you know, this is just line it up here, get our line on there, marking it so that we do not go past that line. It is quite literally a guideline. Now what I typically do is set the actual slot depth on the guitar, and I will do that on this guitar as well, but I usually will start the slots, and you want to make sure that you aren't going too deep when you start the slots. Alright, we're back up at the desk here. I'm doing a little look at this nut that I marked off on the guitar. You can see on this one edge, this is the edge where it was sitting a little bit over. You can see this line. This is the line below which we do not want to cut. Not to say that we won't ever go lower than that line, but that is approximately, I say approximately, it's not a dead-on perfect top of the fret, but it's about the top of the frets. So we basically just want to be kissing the top of that line when we start cutting on this thing. So the next thing that we're going to do is take a look at our width. Now I had no problem with the way the strings were spaced on the original nut on this guitar. So got the old calipers here. And if you think these are really expensive, they're like 20 bucks. They aren't super expensive. You can get, actually I think you can get them as low as 10. I've actually pre-measured this, but we're looking at roughly 1.4 inches slot to slot. That's center to center. One thing to bear in mind when you are working on these things is that there are two different main, I mean, I'm sure there's more than two different spacing things, but there's two main ones that you have. You have your on center, and then you have, I think it's called progressive, or I don't know what it's called. I have no idea what it's called. What is it called? Proportional. I think it's proportional. So in one, you're doing every string, same spacing to center. The other one, you are doing the string slightly different based on string width. Some people like that better in the just because it provides more space in between the wound strings, between the wound strings. So I don't have any great desire to measure everything down to just the tiny thickness, and frankly, I think I'm probably just used to on center measurement anyway. So. On center it shall be. So the next thing that I'll do, since I measured this was 1.39 based on the original nut, which seems fine. One thing to be aware of though, measure twice, cut once. I'm gonna just type this into my little calculator here. 1.38, okay. 1.38 inches between E and E. Then the other thing I'm gonna do, just measure my inset, which I believe is going to be about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to lock this in a little bit. This little locker inner. Lock this in a little bit so I have this locked into my width. Make sure that I have the nut oriented correctly. That would be a good thing to do. That's the right thing to do. And then I just mark that. Take the top of the nut, take your pencil, just draw a line along the top edge where you're going to be marking, like this. Okay. Do that. See, then you have this little mark right there. You take your calipers and you just score it right across there. It leaves a little mark. You see that little mark right there? There you go. Do it right there. And then we go back to our original measurement, which was the 1.38. Zero this guy out again. 1.38. I'm measuring it all off of the one edge. Why? Because the other edge I am going to be trimming down. So I don't want to measure in from this side because that little part with the gray on there, that's going to be gone. So we measure off this line right here. Line that puppy up right there. We just score it with our calipers, and then I break out the Bob Newhart edition here. Break these guys out. Okay, now I can do surgery with these things. This is amazing. Okay, so we are right there and right there. 1.38, 1.3. There we are. Now, we take our 1.38 and we divide it by 5. 0.276. Zero it out again. I always zero it out in between. Okay, let me actually show this here. 0.219, 243, 275. It's fine. It's fine. It's 5/1000ths of an inch. It's not, once again, it's not the end of the world. I'm not such a great guitar player, nor is anyone who's ever going to play that guitar such a great guitar player that they're going to notice that amount of a difference. Line up with the marks, and you just line it up and mark it. Line it up and mark it. Line it up and mark it. And line it up and verify it. Make sure that we have okay. So here we have, you can see low E, A, D, G, B, E. Okay, I'm going to measure the center line. You always want to have a good center line. on anything like this to make sure that you get it mounted up onto the guitar correctly. Exciting new purchase here, which is this set of nut files. I got them off of eBay. These are gauged nut files, which means that they're allegedly these thicknesses that are written on the handles. So this should be like you know, 0.010, so this should be 10 thousandths. This should be 13 thousandths, and then the back side is another size. I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm not going to show this because it's kind of boring, but I did take the caliper to each of these, and they're all slightly bigger than, well, they're not all slightly bigger, but the small ones are slightly bigger than the larger, than the size that's on them. So is that the end of the world? I don't think so. Some people might think so. So I'm just taking the narrowest one on a backstroke. Now these are actually, this file, the teeth are canted forward. So this is your big cutting stroke, right? I don't want to do a big cutting stroke on the first stroke. I want to do a very mild and accurate back cut on this first one. Because if I screw it up, I don't want the thing to go very deep. And I'm using this finger as a guide to make sure that it lines up. And the nice thing about the calipers is that they provide a little notch when you score. It allows you to pull back on the nut. And what I'm going to do with this one, I'm just going to turn it so I can still use my finger as a gauge. Now, I have my, I'm just going to cut my guide slots. Everything looks good here. I'm just going to do a quick measurement again. That's perfect. That's perfect. All right, we have relocated back to the guitar bench. As you can see, we have the nut right here. I still have some pencil on here from when I was marking it out with the vernier calipers, and then I was just using the nut slots or the nut files to just get the very start of a slot on here. Now what I do typically is just set the strings in here. Obviously they're all detuned and loose, and get this just sort of arranged so I can take a quick look and see how even everything is, and I can start adjusting things according to the string pull. Now this is where people typically wind up with the problems on Les Pauls. So they have the problem on the G and on the Ds because they're at the biggest angle. It's not that big of an angle, but you can at this point start moving away from having a perfect 90-degree angle here, right? So this, wow, those two files just stuck together. That's really weird. This doesn't have to be exactly 90 degrees. So what I'll typically do, and this is the way I also approach slotting the nut this way, is you split the difference in angle between your fretboard angle and the angle of the headstock, right? So the headstock angle is what, 17.5 degrees. So this is, you know, roughly half that. Similar thing I do on this axis between the nut, we'll arrange this, between the nut and the tuner. So if we pretend a straight pull to the tuner, okay, and this is the front edge of the nut, so I look at that and then I just adjust slightly to get sort of an intermediate angle onto the actual slot itself. So this is our G slot. So I'm on the front, and I'm just going to start with a couple of backstrokes using my thumb as a guide and just pulling this way. I don't want to move material too fast. I don't want to take it off of the front edge too quickly, and I want to maintain this angle and this angle. So it's best to just work slowly and get it as you like it. Now we don't have to remove a ton of material due to having taken a lot off when I was shaping the blank. Typically a manufactured blank, rather than something that I made in my garage, will have more material in it. So then I will just pull this up here, pop the G string into the slot here, and start to see how things are shaping up. One thing I want to make sure that, okay, the slot is still plenty high, so there's a lot of material left to work in. I don't usually want to go down through too much material because it's really easy to do that and have the slot, instead of going straight down, start to curve because you're cutting too far from where you originally planned to put the slot. So, okay, we're looking good there so far, so I'll pop that back out. These files seem to work pretty well so far. Like I said, they're new to me. There's a lot of places, if you're trying to get files relatively cheap, that are selling basically torch cleaning, tip cleaning rigs, which are just basically sort of little needle files that I don't think would be particularly great for cutting sort of your harder nut materials. One other thing that I want to point out is I did take the caliper and measured the thickness of the files, and it isn't exactly as is stamped. I'm sure they were, you know, they aren't a particularly expensive thing, so that isn't an indictment on anything from, you know, StuMac or anyone else. I'm sure their gauge stuff is just fine. Okay, height-wise, we're getting really close here. I'm done cutting in the G-string slot now. And I will move on to the D. I'm just making my way inward to outward. So, now I will do the same thing for the D string, which that should be or 26. So, similar basic idea. Just start with a couple of setting strokes, splitting the difference on the angle, both on the axis where the headstock is turned and the axis between the face of the nut and the tuner. You know, you don't need to have a whole lot of nut material above the string itself. A little bit more to go on the D, so back to it. Again, I'm making sure that the front of the slot remains the true breakover point for the string. I'm not taking this down as low as I can possibly take it at this point. What I'm doing is getting it pretty close. I don't want to cut it down to a really tight tolerance right yet, because I want to do that after I have the nut set and glued. So I want to have just a little bit of leeway. It doesn't have to be a ton. I mean, this is it's pretty low as it stands, but you know, there's just a tiny little bit of movement on the string, which is what you want. You want to have a little bit. I don't, like I said, I don't typically like take a feeler gauge after it. You could, but you don't have to necessarily. So I'm going to shut off the camera now and finish up this step with the rest of the strings. Okay, so you can see here we have the top of the nut. I still have my pencil coloring in here from where I used it for scribing how far apart the strings should be. You should see the guitar's roughly in tune-ish, not really in tune, but I have the strings about to tension. String nut height is a little bit above where it will finally wind up, but you can see on the G, it's especially prominent in this picture, on where the G is angled slightly. Sorry about that, but you'll see that the G has a bit of an angle to it. The B has a little bit of an angle to it. The D has a little bit of an angle to it. What I'm going to do now is pull this off of the guitar. It isn't glued in yet, and clean up this backside here, round off my corners, get my edges about right. And then I'm going to narrow the top of the nut a little bit here. I'm going to take this to about 1/8 of an inch, which is roughly where a fender nut is width-wise or thickness-wise, is 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to take a little bit off of this back edge, and then I'm also going to open up the back sides of these nut slots in particular. Opening up the back sides will further relax this angle and give less drag for the string to have. Here I'm gluing in the nut. Right there I have my secret weapon, that is Elmer's school glue. You can see I put 2 little dots in there. Here's the nut. Just seating it right there. Push it in, get it equal on both sides. Make sure everything lines up just so. I'm using Elmer's glue because it doesn't have to be a particularly strong glue bond, it just needs to hold it in place. You also have all of the force from the strings holding the nut in place as well, so the glue basically works in conjunction with that. You don't need to go crazy with Gorilla Glue in there or something just to get the thing to adhere. And now the nut is glued in. Okay, here we sit with a somewhat slotted, glued, and set nut. But all of the nut slots are still pretty raw. So I'm starting with some regular wet dry sandpaper. This is just 400 grit. I'm just going to take it in these slots. I don't want the slots to go any deeper. I just want to get the edges of them opened up, particularly this back trailing edge. I will just do a little bit of polishing at the bottoms. I don't really want the bottoms to be reshaped at all. I just want them to be smooth. Even pretty mild sandpaper like this can take off material in a hurry, so you just want to be cognizant of that while you're working on the bottoms of these nut slots here. Now, what I have set up is right now I have 400, this is 600, this is 1000. I'm just going to go through and do this with every grit. I may even go as far as 2000. Just to give it that extra bit of polish in the bottom. Okay, I'm just going to show a little bit of an update here. It doesn't really look like much difference. I've gone through with my 3 main grits of sandpaper. One thing that I found that worked out pretty well, what I used to do is I did this with feeler gauges. I would take the feeler gauge, wrap it in sandpaper, except for the very narrowest slots. The narrowest slots typically folded over sandpaper is close to the thickness of a high E string anyway, so I would just fold that over the feeler gauge and go through there. But what I did for this was I would put the paper around the file itself, just use that. Once again, I'm just doing the back side here of these slots. The front side, I just want to get a little bit of a polish on it, but I don't really want to change the shape at all. The back side, I want to not just polish, but I want to open it up a little bit. So that's what I was doing. And so we have a pretty decent sheen there. Now what I'm going to do is go back to my harsher grits here. I'm just going to be sanding and shaping the nut and getting all of the rough working marks out of it. And I don't know if I'm going to do sort of a full polish up on it or not. I often don't, but this may be the exception. So basically for that, what I'm going to be doing is going through with the different grits again and just sanding it to a finer level until we run out of grits, basically. I am up to 1000 grit. Actually, no, this is 2000 grit. I'm using just for some light buffing of the top of the nut. Now, is this properly down to 2000 grit? No, it's not completely down to 2000 grit, but I also am not a guy who always does the nut up to a perfect glossy sheen. Now what I have here is just some regular old white string. I'm just running through the slots just to kind of clean out gunk. Is really the technical term for it. We're cleaning out gunk. That's, in my mind, that is a shiny enough nut. So I'm just going to put a little bit of lead in there from a pencil, and this is some super scientific technique I use here. See, yeah, the tip of the pencil. See, actually, that feels like a good bottom to the nut slot there. So that's a nice feeling. Now, it's good to know that I just wasted all this time polishing and cleaning just to dirty it up with graphite again, but that it feels like there isn't anything catching on the tip of the pencil. I'm going to take this tape off here, restring it, and we'll see how it works. All right, thank you for staying with me this far. As you can tell, there have been an awful lot of videos involved in the making of this whole nut video. Here you can see the finished product right there. There we have our delightful nut. And as you can see, or you can hear, I should say, you know, it stays in tune. If you're doing this for your own guitar, or for anyone else's actually for that matter, what I recommend are a couple of things. First off, if you're doing this for other people, if you haven't done this with a lot of customers before, and you are sort of stepping into the world of either being like a store tech or you know, just a regular repair tech, make sure when you put strings on that you stretch them thoroughly. Don't have half stretched strings going out, because someone will grab the thing and their nut has just been recut and they'll play something and then the string will go flat and they'll be upset because, like, hey, this wasn't supposed to go out of tune, you know. Now, fixing things on the nut doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to behave on the tuner, for example. In the case of this guitar, I had the same strings on here before, during and after. You all saw it. But after I tuned everything back up again, this string these windings had to settle back in. And I don't even know how long these strings have been on this guitar, or how well I had stretched them before I started this project anyway. So I had to stretch all of the strings on both sides of the nut. Now it stays in tune just fine, as expected. If there were problems in the nut, it would bind in the nut. That's your proof of problems right there. One thing I kind of have a theory about is that a lot of people's inexperience with working with the nut, or a lot of people's apprehension about it, might come from, when you think about it, like my generation and a little bit older. You know, I'm 45, people who are a little bit older even, a lot of us were able to opt into locking nuts relatively early on in our playing, and therefore we're never really forced to learn all of the things that go into you know, the nut of the guitar, what makes it work well, what makes it not work well, you know, what you need to do. And I mean, and there is a certain amount of, you know, maintenance that you do need to do with even a correctly cut and functioning nut. Once again, it's like, it doesn't even matter, like the headstock layout, it really doesn't matter. You still need to do this if it's straight pull or whatever else. You know, you still need to make sure that you know, the slots are correctly sized for the strings that you have on there, or that they're adequately sized, I should say. They're wide enough and deep enough, etc. You also need to make sure that, you know, you have a little bit of a lubrication in there, and that you have a correct string stretching regimen when you change strings, or else you will have tuning instability, regardless of what the layout is. And that will happen on straight string pulls too. Straight string pull doesn't correct a poorly cut nut. It doesn't fix anything with it. It just makes, I mean, it might cover some errors there, but for example, if you have V-shaped nut slots, you're going to still have tuning problems with a straight pull, or very likely, unless you're really lucky. But so I mean, there is a time and a place for straight pull too, not saying that there isn't. I mean, it's just fine if that's what you want to do, but this isn't such an extreme design, getting back to the original video, that you can't have it stay in tune and have a normally cut nut. It just comes down to cutting it correctly, which I don't think a lot of people do or have done. It's much easier to complain on the internet about it and then spend money on different nut materials, thinking that the material is what makes the difference. And to a degree it can make a difference, but by and large most of the problems aren't necessarily with the material. They're very often with the actual cutting of the nut. So with that, I will close this down. I think I'm going to do a little video with a little bit of actual playing with this guitar. I thought that might be a neat way to sort of close off each little sub-project of the more from less experience. Thanks. Bye.